What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy. I'm not here to talk to you about the National Football League today. I'm here to talk to you about spring football. Birmingham Stallions, they're back looking for a four-peat. Who's going to stop them? That's what we're going to talk about for the next 2.5 months here. The United Football League kicks off this Friday night with a game between the St. Louis Battlehawks and the Houston Roughnecks. And we are here to break down the very first UFL DFS slate of the 2025 season. Super excited to be back talking about some football contests with you guys. Just a little bit of housekeeping as we get started with UFL this season. Little bit of a different format. We talked about this last year's preview video. If you guys were playing with us last year, then you know this. You only need one running back, two pass catchers, and you have two flex spots in your UFL Classic lineups. Single game here on DraftKings, exact same format with a captain and 5 flex plays, but the Classic slate, completely different animal. Every week we get a 4-game slate with staggered start times, and this year the UFL is going to Friday Night Football. We are kicking off tomorrow evening, March 28th, with the first edition of Friday Night Football here in the UFL, hopefully the start of a long tradition that we can leverage and enjoy each spring. I want to give a shout out to DraftKings Sportsbook. These are some of your odds for the opening weekend of UFL action here. We are opening up this week with the Birmingham Stallions as the biggest favorites on this slate. They're favored by 7 points in their matchup against the DC Defenders on the road here. DC is going through a little bit of turmoil. Head coach Reggie Barlow left the Defenders a week before the season started. He accepted a job at Tennessee State for the 2025 season, so that has thrown DC into a little bit of flux here, but hasn't really affected the spread at all. Birmingham was favored by 7 before that news broke here. Second biggest favorite, tomorrow night's opening game, we have the St. Louis Battlehawks favored by 6 points on the road against the Houston Roughnecks. Houston also carrying the lowest team total this week, with this game having one of the lower totals overall. Michigan on the road favored by 5.5 points against the Memphis Showboats. Showboats also got unfortunate news that head coach Ken Wisenhunt, who had been helping them prepare for the season right up until Sunday, Monday of this week, he had to leave the Showboats due to personal reasons. So the Showboats, another team that wasn't super hot last year, facing some turmoil here in the beginning of the season, going up against a team that made the playoffs last year, and that's why the line has actually moved 2 to 2.5 points to Michigan's favor here. They were originally favored by 3 points before that Ken Wisenhunt news broke. And then the closest game on the table here, San Antonio Brahmas, last year's XFL champions who fell to the Stallions in the title game. They're going on the road against the Arlington Renegades here, and they are favored by 3 points in what should be a really exciting game on Saturday afternoon between two Texas squads here. So how are we going to be playing this slate? Well, the good news is we like to look at the same thing we look at in our NFL contest, guys. For those of you who are watching us throughout the entire NFL season for our regular season preview videos, let's start by looking at the biggest favorites on this slate to try to figure out which running backs are going to be in the best position to succeed based off of game script opportunities. And this week, we do have the Birmingham Stallions. They are the biggest favorites. However, you see here, CJ Marable, Ricky Person Jr., similar output in terms of fantasy points per game on average in 2024's UFL season. That is because they had virtually identical workloads for touches. Marable is the top line running back here for the Birmingham Stallions. He's been with the club since the inaugural 2022 United States Football League season, and he has been kind of the unofficial captain of the team. He's been the true leader of the Stallions, kind of this guy that they rally around, kind of the anchor of this offense year to year, right? So I do think Marable probably has his usual workload of 8 to 10 touches in the backfield, and he gets involvement in the passing game. That is another big thing with CJ Marable in this Stallions offense. Going back to the end of the regular season last year, we saw 3+ targets in 4 out of the last 6 games for the Stallions for Marable, and that is what separates him a little bit from Ricky Person Jr. Ricky Person Jr. will probably have slightly more upside on the ground. Saw a very big game for him in the championship, 13 carries, 102 yards last May for the Stallions against the Brahmas, but not a ton of targets at all for Ricky Person Jr. So I do think that is how you separate these two out. Person, slightly cheaper here, but you're basically flipping a coin, picking a running back with the Birmingham Stallions. Not sure, even with the big spread, that the running back is the right play here in the Stallions backfield. The next biggest favorite, however, is probably where we want to go for our number one running back play in all contest types this week, and that's going to be the St. Louis Battlehawks, favored by 6 points on the road against the Houston Roughnecks here to begin the season in week 1 down in Houston. Jacob Sailors was the number one running back in the UFL last season. That was both on the ground and with his involvement in the passing game. Flashed a ceiling of 6+ targets in the middle of the season here in games against Houston and against Birmingham. So that is definitely something to keep in mind with Sailors. He's going to be the most popular running back play on this slate at $9,300 for St. Louis, and probably the most reliable player on the Battlehawks to slot into your lineup, because we have a little bit of a change with the Battlehawks under center. AJ McCarron no longer with the Battlehawks. We're going to see a little bit of a 2 QB tandem between Manny Wilkins, who has been with Anthony Becht and the Battlehawks for a couple of years here. He's finally going to get a chance. He's finally getting a chance to start a little bit for them. However, we have been told that Max Duggan out of TCU, previously with the Los Angeles Chargers for a little bit in training camps and preseasons, he's going to get a little bit of an opportunity to play as well. We're expecting both of these guys to get time under center, and that's going to make for a very different feel for the Battlehawks here. A little bit different look for the Battlehawks compared to what we're used to seeing from previous iterations of the Battlehawks in both the XFL and the UFL over the last couple of years. More on the Battlehawks when we talk about pass catchers. The Michigan Panthers, they have a little bit of a change at running back this year. They had 2023 USFL leading rusher and standout Wes Hills playing in a tandem with USFL Philadelphia Star standout Matthew Colburn to begin 2024. However, last year Hills got hurt. They did not bring Hills back this season, and Colburn is still with the team. We saw Colburn get huge workloads towards the end of the season as well without Hill available. Look at this 24 carry game in literally Michigan's last head-to-head matchup with these Memphis Showboats. 24 carries, 2 touchdowns, also had a couple of targets in the air. Colburn was like the number one running back in the USFL with the Philadelphia Stars as well. So there's definitely pedigree and ceiling here with Colburn. And with the line moving in Michigan's favor, I do think Colburn becomes a great play at his cost. But there's also Nate McCrary here, comes in a little bit lower, and he has definitely earned a little bit of work here for Mike Nolan and the Panthers in this offense. Basically split work with Matthew Colburn in that playoff game against the Birmingham Stallions as well. So got to keep him on your radar if you're looking to play a Michigan running back here this week. Colburn, by far the better play. McCrary, a little bit of NFL pedigree in preseasons with Baltimore as well. Colburn, by far the better play here for Michigan. We're expecting him to be listed as the top line starter. The final favorite, the San Antonio Brahmas. They had a really, really, really good season last year. They were returning a lot of the same personnel, a lot of the same coaches. This is still going to be A.J. Smith's very high upside run and shoot offense, which we fell in love with the XFL's version of the Roughnecks, and obviously last year's Brahmas, who made a run towards the championship here. Anthony McFarland and John Lovett both showed they were capable of earning bell cow level touches, and also capable of producing on those touches throughout last year's season. Lovett really produced in the middle of the season while McFarland was unavailable, but basically once McFarland returned, he basically took over the backfield once again. So I think that's what we're waiting to see here from San Antonio, by the way. We want to see how they list these two guys, but if the trend that they ended the season with last year continues, Anthony McFarland probably should out-touch John Lovett here, and they're priced accordingly. McFarland is $8,700. John Lovett is $6,700, and Lovett really had no touches whatsoever in San Antonio's last meaningful game there, that championship against Birmingham, where they struggled 1 carry to 9 for McFarland. So if we are flipping a coin here, probably McFarland will be the guy to start. For the San Antonio Brahmas, I would consider Sailors, locking him into your running back spot first game of the weekend, especially if you're playing low-risk contests, and just kind of moving on here. The opportunity in week one is going to come from finding some differentiation at the wide receiver / tight end position. And in last year's preview video, I spent a little bit of time talking about how in week one, the tight ends who had far less competition for playing time, for snaps, for routes, were like across the board underpriced. This year's a little different. So your top tight end is probably Arlington Sal Cannella. He's the most expensive pass catcher on the Renegades for a reason here. Definitely has a high floor with the amount of targets that he sees in this offense, 7+ targets in each of the last 5 games. Basically identical pass catching starters anyway, coming back for the Renegades here with Cannella at tight end and some of the top receivers in Tyler Vaughns, Javonte Payton returning for Luis Perez. Cannella, definitely a great value here. The other tight ends that should see a lot of playing time, who else, right? We go with Birmingham. We've got Jace Sternberger at $6,400. It's a pretty good price for a tight end. I feel pretty good about considering, obviously, Cannella, but also Sternberger for some of your low-risk contests if you want to work in a little bit of target floor that's likely to be there. But the tight end value is not as strong this year as it was last year, so I do think we're returning to looking at some of these wide receiver plays. The usual suspects, for those of you who have followed the UFL, lead the salary table here for pass catchers. Hakeem Butler is your number 1 receiver in the UFL for the St. Louis Battlehawks. Chantre Kirkland led San Antonio in opportunities. Also a great play here. Justin Hall was phenomenal for Houston. Tremendously high ceiling. We saw him eclipse 30+ fantasy points in his second to last game, last season against the Michigan Panthers. Definitely capable of doing that once again. Huge target ceiling here. But this is not where you're going to find differentiation. This is definitely where you're going to find ownership. This group of receivers at the top of the salary table going to be very, very popular this week, especially Justin Hall at $8,800 with Houston being an underdog. Would expect Anthony Brown of the Houston Roughnecks to target Hall pretty extensively. What I wanted to talk about for this video, instead of getting into like lineup strategy and best plays, because we don't really have a lot of statistics to go off of. We don't really have any statistics to go off of for week one here, because we're all just kind of trying to be soothsayers, trying to predict where these offenses are going to go to begin the season. I wanted to draw the line at $7,000 and look at the best plays below that. And I'm going to give you one player from each team that I have my eye on this week that I think could make some noise and that I think could be worth us following all year long to slot into our DFS lineups as we get ready for another UFL season. So I'm going to start with the Arlington Renegades. And Javonte Payton, JP Payton, depending on where you look, depending on who you listen to, goes by a little bit of both names here. 18.2 yard average depth of target in the 2024 season for Bob Stoops in this offense from Luis Perez. He had 42 targets in 8 games, a ton of work for the Renegades here, and he comes in at just $6,700. That's quite a value compared to Sal Cannella, compared to Tyler Vaughns. So I think you can comfortably consider Payton with some upside, with some ceiling here in this Renegades offense. Saw him eclipse 20+ fantasy points twice here in the middle of the season, once against the Brahmas and once against the Memphis Showboats, demonstrating that he absolutely is capable of giving us a stellar performance. And that high ADOT, right, over 18 yards, that means he doesn't need a tremendous amount of opportunities to get there, although he did have those with the amount of targets that he got last year. So hopefully that continues for the Renegades here in 2025. Still waiting on a final depth chart for Arlington for this weekend. With the Birmingham Stallions, this is probably the deepest team in the league, by far the prohibitive favorite once again to win the championship. And when we look at previous iterations of the Stallions, in fact, I think the most logical previous iteration of the Stallions for us to look at is the 2023 USFL champions, because quarterback Alex Magoo, who won the USFL MVP that year, won that MVP with a specific subset of players. Running backs here are the same players that he had in that championship season. They returned for 2024. They're back for 2025. Here at wide receiver, we've got Deion Kane was on that team, but he was not the number 1 receiver for the USFL Stallions in 2023. The number 1 receiver was actually Davion Davis, who was just $4,100 this weekend. Now, we don't have a Stallions depth chart. This is a really deep wide receiver room. So it is not a lock that Davion Davis goes into a starting role, gets a ton of opportunities to begin the season, but we know what the ceiling is here because in that 2023 season, Davis had 47 receptions, 705 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns on 66 targets. Far and away the wide receiver one for the Stallions, even over Deion Kane, last year's wide receiver one for Adrian Martinez and Matt Corral. Something that complicates that a little bit further, 2022's leading receiver in the first iteration of the Stallions offense, Marlon Williams, got injured at the very beginning of the 2023 USFL season, and that's sort of what led to the opportunity for Davis to be a top-line receiver to begin with for Birmingham. So that's the challenge that we have here for, us to navigate as prognosticators, if you will, trying to predict what Skip Holtz and the Stallions are going to do on offense. We've seen the ceiling from Davis. We've also seen it from Marlon Williams. We've most recently seen it across a couple of different seasons with the most expensive player here in Deion Kane. And then we also have Amari Rodgers, who was the primary slot receiver in 2024 in the UFL. And that, by the way, is the spot where both Marlon Williams and Davion Davis shined the most for Birmingham in previous iterations of this Stallions football team. So maybe you want to rewind that, watch that back again. I'll give you a quick summary here. Davion Davis, to me, I think, is a great play this week because he has that rapport specifically with presumptive starting quarterback Alex Magoo as his number one receiver from a couple of years ago in this offense. So I expect Magoo to go back to the well and be comfortable with Davion Davis. $4,100, great tournament play. Davis is not guaranteed to have that playing time, though, because of how deep the rotation at wide receiver here is for the Birmingham Stallions. But my number one play on this list of players under $7,000 on each team to consider this week for contests. All right, the DC Defenders. Absolute turmoil in the coaching staff, not so much with the players here. Jordan Ta'amu is expected to return under center. He's been their starter for several years now. He's going for his third season, XFL 2023, last year in the first season of the UFL, and now here the second season in the UFL. Going back to the 2023 UFL season, number one running back from the 2023 UFL is actually returning as well, Abram Smith. This is an underdog side, so we didn't really talk about Abram Smith when I was going over running backs earlier, but I keep an eye on that. That's some consistency as far as personnel is concerned as well. Ta'amu and Smith, the backfield, looking pretty stable there. And then we have Ty Scott, last year's number one receiver in terms of production for the Defenders, back as well, lining up, split out wide for Jordan Ta'amu. A player also returning from last year, and no stranger to spring football, also a previous member of the USFL's Philadelphia Stars in 2022 and 2023, Chris Rowland has a real shot to make some waves here, not just in week one, but throughout the season. He got some run in the slot last year. Rowland on an 11.7 yard average depth of target on his 35 targets, which he turned into 20 receptions, 262 yards, and 3 touchdowns in DC's offense last year. And he also has a little bit of upside for like a jet sweep or a creative play out of the backfield where they scheme him the ball on a relatively easy touch. You can see that by looking at those rush attempts here on the screen for some of his box score results from last year. So at $5,500 here on DraftKings, we get a little bit more upside with Rowland because this is a player that the Defenders scheme open. That is the most important thing. We're not trying to take zeros here in our lineups, but we're also looking for some plays that have a little bit more upside at lower costs as well. Speaking of players that are able to play dual threat roles, we have Kirk Merritt with the Houston Roughnecks. Now, he's not the starting tailback for this offense. That's actually going to be Lorenzo Lingard. He was listed as the first running back for the opening game tomorrow night. Lingard is definitely going to catch a little bit of ownership just because he's the minimum price and he's going to be a starting tailback, even though this is an underdog with one of the lowest totals of the week. Merritt, I think, is a little bit of a better play because you see in limited work, dealt with some injuries last year for Houston. He gets targets, 5+ targets in each of the 3 games that he played last year. Preseason legend as well, if you've been playing some preseason DFS previously with the New Orleans Saints, with some upside for some carries in the backfield. So Kirk Merritt, $6,600, Going to see some action both in the backfield and some scheme touches in the passing game. I like that here for showdown if we get a showdown contest, but also for the 4-game slate at a modest price tag. The Memphis Showboats. More absolute pandemonium, if you will, with the coaching staff with Wisenhunt stepping down. A player that I think was probably slated to have a bigger role with Memphis last year, and it got derailed due to injury, Isaiah Henne. Henne was awesome in the USFL. The USFL North Division champions in 2023, the Pittsburgh Maulers, RIP, he was their number 1 receiver. He had 60 receptions, 612 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns on 86 targets for that Pittsburgh team. And I think Memphis is a team that's starving for somebody to take over a really large role, especially now that Dawood Davis, last year's number 1 opportunity getter in this passing game, is unavailable, at least to begin the season, if not for the whole season. So at $4,700, Henne definitely someone that I'm keeping my eye on for that initial depth chart from Memphis, because I think he's shown in the past in spring football that he's capable of handling the volume, and I wouldn't be surprised if he demonstrates that again moving forward here with Memphis, with whoever's under center. The Michigan Panthers, CFL legend Siaosi Mariner here, just $6,200. 46 targets last year in 7 games for Memphis, 31 receptions, 406 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. Led the team despite not playing the most games. He actually got more targets than Marcus Sims, who we talked about week in and week out with Michigan last year. Definitely see a really good opportunity to get 6+ targets from Mariner here at a decent cost. That 1 target game against DC that you see on the screen here, he got hurt in that game, and that is why his numbers kind of cratered a little bit at the end of the season, but this was an absolute target monster for the Panthers when healthy, when he joined the team last year. San Antonio Brahmas. This team is pretty much identical except for the new quarterback. They've got their 2 most productive running backs from last year. They're returning their top 3 receivers in Jontre Kirkland, Marquez Stevenson, and Justin Smith. I'm curious to see how Greg Ward disrupts that wide receiver room, because this is a player that's making somewhat of a homecoming to San Antonio. Shout out to the Alliance of American Football, 2019's San Antonio Commanders. Greg Ward, an alum of that team. Ward probably has the most productive professional football career here out of anybody on this roster. Was a member of the Philadelphia Eagles a few years ago, 2020, 2021, I believe, and had a tremendous amount of success as a specialist and as a slot receiver. So that's what I'm looking to see San Antonio do and use Greg Ward as. Just another asset in A.J. Smith's high up-tempo, fast, high pass volume offense who can run a tremendous amount of routes from any spot on the field. Greg Ward, just $6,600. I'm expecting him to be heavily involved to begin the season. St. Louis. A lot of turnover at wide receiver here. We have Hakeem Butler returning to the top line. We have Ja'Cour Pearson, who was an awesome top-line asset for the Seattle Sea Dragons in the 2023 XFL, but didn't really have a ton of opportunity last year until the middle of the season because he was injured to begin the year for St. Louis. Now Darius Shepard's not on this team anymore, so that opens up some opportunity. He's listed as a starter here alongside Hakeem Butler, but those guys are expensive this week. So who can we look at that has an opportunity to produce here? And the other receiver listed as a top-line starter for St. Louis on the initial depth chart for Friday night's opening game, Frank Darby, has NFL pedigree previously of the Atlanta Falcons, didn't really produce a ton of box score numbers, but when we have someone with NFL pedigree starting in an offense that we think has a tremendous amount of upside at low to no ownership here in week 1, Frank Darby definitely needs to be on our radar as someone to consider here to begin the season. I'm really excited to get into the UFL here. I'm excited to get into week 2 when we have a little bit more data and we're able to make, I guess, slightly more intelligent decisions about how to craft our lineups. But this list here of guys to consider that all definitely have a wide range of outcomes, by the way. There's like no floor with a lot of these guys I talked about here, but the ceilings are tremendous if we do get them. So this is kind of a pool of guys I'm really, really interested in for high-risk contests this week. Quarterback position, just to tie a bow around this video, focus on playing time. Focus on getting someone in your lineup that you're pretty confident is going to play the majority of the game. The field this week is going to be playing Kellen Mond from San Antonio because the UFL analyst community knows A.J. Smith, knows San Antonio, knows the high upside of this offense. $9,000, not that bad of a price tag. I do think Alex Magoo, returning to spring football streets, expected to be the starter for the Birmingham Stallions at $8,500. Also going to be relatively popular. Keep an eye on playing time expectations for Matt Corral, who started a few games last year for Skip Holtz. That would be the only thing that pulls back on Alex Magoo's ownership this week. We have Tamu, who basically plays every snap for DC. That's a relatively safe play for playing time. Huge underdog this week, and so maybe not as popular as he otherwise should be. Same goes for Luis Perez. We know he's going to drop back and throw the football 30 plus times, but he has to throw for touchdown passes. He has to produce because there's no rushing upside here, but he should play the entire game, and we can't necessarily say that for more than half the teams a lot in the UFL. Finally, I think the player that I'm most interested in to see how much he does play, how much run he does get, it's right in this first game. Anthony Brown, dual threat quarterback, going to be the starter for the Houston Roughnecks. A little bit of a surprise. However, he will be splitting some time with Nolan Henderson, who was last year's starter for a few games. And the question becomes, what does that split look like? At $6,900, Brown definitely tremendous amount of upside at cost, but will he play enough to pay off putting him in your lineup, never mind the price tag? So that's the thing to think about with quarterback. You need to make sure that they're actually going to play the vast majority, if not all of the game, because that actually is a variable that matters here in UFL week in and week out. On defense, look, I don't think people are going to get too crazy here. Birmingham, St. Louis, Michigan, all big favorites. Salary, not an issue this week, especially with some of these plays that I talked about in this video from each team that you can consider that are not going to be super popular. That's going to do it for me for week one of the UFL season, guys. Good luck this week. I do post a lot of stuff in our Discord about what I'm thinking about for UFL, so I will have projections for every game this weekend available by Friday in there, so you're not going to want to miss that. But most importantly, hit that like button if you want to see more UFL content throughout the rest of the spring. I'll produce preview videos, and maybe I'll work in some more things if you guys want more UFL content. We'll be back